Thanks to the often beautiful 2D graphics and refreshingly simplistic mechanics, plenty of SEGA Genesis games have been received a lot more positively as the years have gone by. Arguably, some of those games even more so than anything on the PS1, Sega Saturn or N64. With that in mind, we're looking at the Genesis games that have aged pretty beautifully. No, this list doesn't include Sonic 2 or 1 or 3, even if they have all aged beautifully, but nobody really needs to hear more about Sonic and the Genesis, do they? In hindsight, X-Men 2 Clone Wars sounds like some sort of unholy collaboration between Marvel and Star Wars, though, considering both are owned by Disney at this point, let's stop talking just in case someone from Disney is watching. And they usually are. And if they are, release the Treasure Planet 4K Blu-ray, cowards. A platformer,
which was the style at the time.
X-Men 2 Clone Wars adapted the Phalanx storyline that was happening within the comic books, with Big Baldy himself, Charles Xavier, sending the X-Men out to a Sentinel manufacturing facility in the middle of nowhere. The Phalanx, which was an alien hive mind of sorts that behaved like a highly infectious techno-organic virus, my least favourite kind of virus, has begun assimilating organisms to take over the world, and it's up to Beast, Psylocke, Gambit, Nightcrawler, Wolverine and Cyclops to save the day. Oh, and Magneto, because the leader of the Brotherhood can't rule the Earth if the Phalanx takes his home of Exodus. The enemy of my enemy is not my enemy for a little bit, or whatever the saying is. While X-Men 2 Clone Wars received mixed reviews at the time of release in 1995, its stock has risen considerably in the years since, with many retrospective reviews commenting on the beautiful graphics and killer soundtrack. However, it's the pick up and play gameplay that's the real winner for this game. The controls are easy to learn, while each character has their own unique abilities that help them in both combat and platforming. Compared to other comic book games of the time where character selection came across like a cosmetic choice rather than a mechanical one, X-Men 2 Clone Wars feels like it graduated first in class and its days aren't future past. Eh? Yeah, we'll workshop that. Apocalypse. These days, the Phantasy Star series is mostly known as an MMORPG franchise, bringing together thousands of players for the common goal of completing raids and building houses, apparently. Before the advent of Ethernet cables and that awful dial-up connection noise though, Phantasy Star was Sega's equivalent of Final Fantasy, offering turn-based RPGs on the Master System and SEGA Genesis. These 4 games have been received pretty well over the years, but most would tend to agree that the first 2 or 3 games have been dated a bit more than other RPGs of the time period. Phantasy Star 4, The End of the Millennium, on the other hand, has only improved in the estimation of many, and considering it was already a pretty well received RPG, you know it's aged pretty dang well. The conclusion of a story surrounding the Algol star system, despite being set about 1,000 years between the events of both Phantasy Star 2 and 3, Phantasy Star 4 starts on Motavia, a once thriving planet that's begun to deteriorate as ancient technology fails and mutant aberrations called biomonsters have been springing up like hipster coffee shops in newly gentrified urban areas. You'll gather a band of hunters to find out the source of the planet's ills, uncovering a threat to the entire star system in the process. The turn-based combat and exploration are still brilliant today like they were in the 90s, but the improvements Phantasy Star 4 made to its own formula, such as combo attacks and the manga quality art for cutscenes and conversations, have helped cement Phantasy Star 4 as a greatest of all time contender. Quick question for you, what was the last Phantasy Star game that Sonic team developed? Comment the answer down below and you could win a free Steam key for free. Turns out that it wasn't just the console itself that was subject to name changes depending on the region it was being sold in, as some of the games went through that process too. In this instance though, North America might have got the better name, as Beyond Oasis feels like a more accurate title for the game than The Story of Thor, its name here in Europe. I mean, Beyond Oasis doesn't even have a dude swinging a tiny little hammer, and the box art is so basic. Don't worry, Europe would get its revenge eventually though. Mythical nonsense aside, while Beyond Oasis doesn't have any real ties to Norse mythology, it does showcase Sega's pretty viable alternative to Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda series that has surprisingly not been appreciated a lot by Sega themselves for a long time. Set in the titular land of Oasis, players control the warrior Prince Ali, who has recently gained possession of a golden amulet that belonged to an ancient wizard. Suddenly, a vision of flame tells him that an evildoer is going to use a silver armlet to spread chaos, and that Ali needs to reunite the 4 elemental spirits to save the land. The gameplay pretty closely follows the Zelda format, playing out like an action-adventure as Ali explores the world, finding dungeons filled with new weapons and elemental spirits to recruit. And while the homework-copied version of Zelda's gameplay might not be Beyond Oasis's best feature, the absolutely incredible graphics have ensured that this game has remained a highlight of the SEGA Genesis well into the 2020s. We could make a whole point out of how Vector Man has aged incredibly well based purely on its plot alone, which starts with humanity leaving Earth behind thanks to unchecked pollution, while robots have been left to clean up the mess. The obvious plot comparisons to WALL-E come to screeching halt though, when one of the robots basically straps themselves to a nuke and becomes the tyrant warhead, but it's clear that Vector Man's plot was more forward-thinking than other video games of the time. Clearly, the fine chaps at both Sega and Blue Sky Software, not to be confused with Blue Sky Studios, the team behind Ice Age, were concerned about the environment being ravaged and the dangers of AI in control of human weaponry way before they became some of the most common talking points of the 2020s. Metal Gear Solid 2, eat your heart out. Admittedly, Vector Man's gameplay isn't quite what makes it such a timeless classic, though the TD shoot 'em up gameplay is just as competent as many other games from the SEGA Genesis. However, it's Vector Man's graphical qualities that make it such a wonderful game to play today, with the animation of Vector Man himself and the beautiful backgrounds proving that the SEGA Genesis still had some juice in the tank at the tail end of its life cycle. Shame then that Sega have basically left Vector Man to rot in the vaults in the years since, as this original game stands among the best that the Genesis has to offer. The sequel is pretty good too, if you like shooting bugs instead of robots. Can we get through one of these videos without hyping up our beloved Treasure just a little bit? Treasure lived up to their name by being one of the most imaginative and innovative developers of the Sega Genesis era. They might have been a bit of a buried prize for some, but for those willing to do a bit of digging, Treasure was the byword for incredible quality games. As for the best Treasure game on the Genesis, most would tend to focus on games like Gunstar Heroes or Dynamite Headdy, both of which are excellent in their own right, but we're focusing on a Treasure game that doesn't get the love it deserves sometimes: Alien Soldier. A shoot-'em-up that's being compared heavily and favourably to Gunstar Heroes, Alien Soldier's baffling plot of human-animal hybrid terrorists and the game's protagonist, Epsilon Eagle, living as a parasite inside a young boy isn't just a discarded Rick and Morty episode. Instead, Alien Soldier feels like one of the earliest versions of a boss rush style game, with 25 levels of run and gun gameplay mostly defined by some incredible boss fights. The animation that Treasure utilises for these fights is nothing short of technological wizardry, creating some of the most memorable enemies on the entire console. Meanwhile, players could choose their weapon loadouts after every continue, adding more strategy and depth to what could have been a simple yet brutally difficult shooter. If you want to see where the DNA of Cuphead came from, Alien Soldier is a pretty great starting point. Racing games typically either age beautifully or they age like Fast and the Furious movies 5 minutes after they come out. Typically, it's the more realistic racing games that tend to age the worst, as either the handling starts to feel dated or the graphics have been rendered awful by the passage of time. Virtua Racing sits more in the former category, which is just as well as it's considered to be the racing game genre's first proper foray into the third dimension, though I will always remember that arcade game in Dawn of the Dead. While the handling takes plenty of getting used to for the average player these days, the general gameplay is just as fun now as it was on the Genesis in the 90s. Quite frankly, the fact that Virtua Racing was even able to run on the Genesis possibly proves that SEGA dabbled in the dark arts at one point, though the trade-off was that Virtua Racing retailed at $100 at launch. Oof. The incredible blocky graphics have certainly aged compared to the lavish production values of most modern racing games, but that doesn't mean that Virtua Racing has lost a step in the aesthetics department. The bright colours certainly help, and the fact that this is the first 3D racing game of its kind means all the Gran Turismos and Burnouts of the world have this game to thank. Still, the influx of indie racing games like Hotshot Racing, Formula Retro Racing, and Super Retro GP have proved that there's plenty of nostalgia and love for games like Virtua Racing. Virtua Racing might not have a lot of tracks, but it does boast plenty of heart, and you can't deny that. However, it doesn't have the iconic music from Daytona USA, so it's clearly an inferior game. We don't make the rules. Actually, we do. Spin that music. Yes, come on! While DC animated projects can be a mixed bag in terms of quality, especially with some of DC's more recent efforts, that Injustice adaptation, more like just piss. Pretty much everyone can agree that the original Batman the Animated Series from the 90s stands among the best superhero shows ever made. The animation style, particularly with regards to the city of Gotham, was unlike anything else of the time period, while the show was anchored by two perfect performances in Kevin Conroy, rest in peace, and Mark Hamill as Batman and Joker respectively. Shockingly, the tie-in video game, named The Adventures of Batman and Robin after the show's second season rebrand, has also aged pretty well, and that's largely based on the aesthetics. Yeah, sure, the gameplay has earned its fair share of criticism, being derided as a fairly simplistic throwing batarangs 'em up that also manages to be frustrating and difficult at the same time. The amount of enemies you have to deal with and the health of many of the bosses gets a bit nuts at a certain point, but the graphics, those graphics, especially the colours and 3D effects on the level backgrounds, pushes the tech of the Genesis in ways few other games did. Artistically, the developers of The Adventures of Batman and Robin had a huge standard to live up to, given the TV show's incredible success, but this game manages to stand on its own with impressive visuals that many thought the Genesis wouldn't be capable of. Say, do you want a pretty reliable way to make a game timeless? Well, just make a 2D beat 'em up, as the legendary beat 'em ups of the SNES and Genesis era are just as much fun to play now as they were back in the 80s and 90s. Final Fight, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Golden Axe and more are all incredibly fun to play today, but perhaps the best of the best is Streets of Rage 2. While the first game is a bit too simplistic in its graphics and gameplay compared to other beat-em-up games of the time period, Streets of Rage 2 is a massive improvement over its predecessor. Despite saving the city in the last game, Axel and Blaze are forced into action again when previous game comrade Adam is kidnapped by Mr. X. With goons on the streets again causing chaos, Axel and Blaze, alongside newcomers Max and Skate, take to cracking skulls in order to achieve justice. The soundtrack alone has been regarded among some of the best music ever created for video games, which is definitely a bold claim, but the gameplay is where Streets of Rage 2 improved immeasurably, with new options like blitz attacks and character-specific special moves ensuring there was more to offer skilled players. If you want to experience the best that the Streets of Rage series has, well, arguably before Streets of Rage 4 came out anyway, Streets of Rage 2 might just be the best beat-em-up game on the Genesis. Hang around until the end of the video for a neat little Easter egg. SEGA Genesis certainly boasted its fair share of RPGs, but one subgenre in particular that was well represented on Sega's console was the tactical RPG. Made famous by games like Tactics Ogre and others, Shining Force 2 was perhaps the console's best take on the tactical RPG genre, with most of the reviews at the time considering it to be an instant classic. Just like Tactics Ogre and the Ogre Battle series as a whole, Shining Force 2 is actually just one part of the wider Shining series, which has nothing to do with blood gushing from an elevator and instead boasts dungeon crawlers, action RPGs and tactical RPGs. But Shining Force 2 is perhaps the best known and most loved entry in the whole franchise. Like other RPGs, Shining Force 2 sees you assembling a party to go out and save the world, with players controlling the Shining Force leader, Bowie. Battles play out on a square-based grid, with characters able to move and perform one action on their turn, and Bowie needs to be protected at all costs, otherwise it's game over. While the graphics aren't really the best that the SEGA Genesis has ever seen, the gameplay ideas and structures shown in Shining Force 2 have aged like fine wine. The gaming industry has seen a huge wave of tactical RPGs dropping across all platforms in recent years, but a lot of the ideas and DNA can be traced back to games like Shining Force 2, making them shining examples of games that have aged wonderfully.
Ugly shot! No good! Yeah!
Talk about lightning in a bottle when it comes to NBA Jam, hey? Midway managed to capture the perfect formula of licensed sports games with NBA Jam in 1993, offering licensed players and teams along with simple to learn gameplay and over-the-top antics and hidden characters. Who doesn't want to see professional basketball players square off against the likes of Bill Clinton? Oh yeah, okay. So yes, some aspects of NBA Jam might not vote as well as others, but this 2v2 version of Hoops offered a recipe for sports games that has seemingly fallen by the wayside, annoyingly, at least when it comes to the licensed offerings. We can always rely on a Mario sports game to bring the silly by the bucket load, thankfully. NBA Jam and the improved Tournament Edition both offered that beloved over-the-top take on 2v2 basketball, with Tournament Edition in particular adding the titular tournament mode, new players to choose from, and a whole new slew of Easter eggs for players to discover. After TE though, the NBA license split between Midway and Acclaim, with Acclaim taking the NBA Jam name in a more sim direction for some reason, and Midway's NBA titles would try to replicate the arcade nature of those first NBA Jam titles to lesser success. Both would ultimately flounder, and while 2K have tried to replicate the arcade-like gameplay of NBA Jam with the NBA Playgrounds games, nothing quite managed to hit the same as hearing Tim Kitzrow screaming,
Boom, shakalaka!
There's a big reason why basketball had a lot of success in the UK in the 1990s, and it's not just because of Space Jam. Outro gang, we made it to the end of another one. What Genesis games do you think aged pretty beautifully as well? Let me know down in the comments down below and we could make a follow-up video. I've been Jimmy for Cultured Vultures, it's been good to have you, and thank you for watching.